post, and you said it's on the Black Indians NC page. All
Going
right, me
live.
now streaming live on Facebook. Hello, Facebook.
What's up?
Yes. All right, we are here. So let me share. So glad to share this into my own. Join us. All right, great. So we are live. Hello, everyone. My name is Kimberly Knight, and I'll be serving as your moderator tonight for Black Indians NC. Welcome back, everyone. We have some new faces tonight, so I'll be doing some intros in just a few. And I want to thank all the viewers that tuned in and watched us last time. I thank you so much for your support. So for opening up tonight, we're going to open up for two young ladies, unfortunately, that were gunned down in Lumberton, North Carolina area this past weekend. I want to give time and space to take a moment of silence for Kayla Kyle and Kimberly Hunt, and for my condolences sincerely to their family and loved ones. So at this moment, we're going to have a moment of silence for them. All right, thank you all so much. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. I have some great panelists joining this time. You're going to see some familiar ones from last time, episode 1, but we also have some new people this time. So I'm excited to introduce them. So back with us is Dr. Allison Mathews. Allison is a 2-time TEDx speaker, researcher, entrepreneur, and community organizer. Ooh, sorry if y'all hear a little storm behind me. It's a little loud. She is the co-founder of HIV Cure Research Day, To Beat HIV, and Digital Links. And she's also, I had to plug this part, a graduate of Howard University and UNC Chapel Hill.
Look at you. Ain't you know?
I knew she was gonna do that. So I had to add that part in there this time. So again, thank you, Allison, for joining us and serving as producer of our show. So yes. Next we also welcome back Frederick Murphy. Since he was young, he's always enjoyed talking to his elders and hearing stories about his family history. And in 2016, he founded History Before Us, a project centered on capturing, preserving, and advocating influential history. His first film, award-winning The American South as We Know It, explores the lives and survivors of Jim Crow, the courageous individuals who didn't make the headlines. His second documentary, The Other Side of the Coin, Race, Generations, and Reconciliation. This film is a collection of experiences and thoughts addressing the complexities of race in America. The participants featured in the film represent a span of different generations, which presents its own unique challenges. These challenges tend to reignite historical transgressions into the fold of present-day ideologies, begging the question, how do we reconcile for the sake of future generations and humanity? So Frederick is also a licensed professional counselor by trade, utilizes tactful questioning, empathy, and reflection to obtain relevant information needed to produce a true narrative of African American and American history. He also has a master's degree in transformative leadership. So welcome back, Frederick. Yay!
How y'all doing?
Yes. Next up, we have Stephen D. Gale. He's back with us. He is the founder and executive director of the Afro-Amerindian Research and Cultural Center, a nonprofit 501c3 organization based in the metro Atlanta, Georgia area. He earned his bachelor's in history education from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke and a Master of Arts in Media and Communications from Norfolk State University. He's currently pursuing his PhD in international conflict management. His research centers on the historical and contemporary interactions of African and Native American populations in the United States from an international conflict management perspective. In addition to his academic career, Stephen is also an independent filmmaker, directing the documentaries Seven City Legacy and By Any Other Name, an exploration of Afro-Amerindian heritage. He is completely developing a film on the life of the noted Philadelphia activist Mattie L. Humphrey. So welcome back, Stephen. Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. And we have two newcomers this time. One is Ms. Portia Mills. She is a Maharan and Black activist from Portsmouth, Virginia, but currently resides in DC metro area. By day, Portia is a sales and marketing manager for major brands and uses their expertise to consult and teach smaller Black and minority-owned businesses to compete with their counterparts. She's the co-founder of the Coalition for Black and Indigenous Solidarity, nonprofit and social justice movement. Portia focuses on bridging the gap between two communities through decolonization of self via education about historical truths and creating a fund for the aforementioned causes and issues affecting the liberation and sovereignty of both Black and Indigenous people. So join me in welcoming Portia Mills.
Hello, everyone.
Hey. And last but not least, Miss Breonna Taylor is an incoming freshman at UNC Chapel Hill, those Tar Heels, and plans on majoring in clinical laboratory science. Breonna is also the creator of Holowassaponi Ancestry DNA Facebook group, which now has over 700 members. Breonna started the group as a way to connect back to her Holowassaponi roots, and also started the group as a way for others who were not living directly in the tribal community to connect back to their roots as well. Breonna has continued to research the unique genetic ancestry of the Holowassaponi tribe and encourages African American and Native American youth to dive into their genealogy and take pride in who they are. Let's welcome Breonna.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, yes. And so, of course, then there's me. My name is Kimberly Knight, and I am the founder of the Black Indians NC Powwow, which we'll be having in 2021, and for this Facebook group, Black Indians NC. So I'm very excited about that. And I know there's a very long resume that I have, but the short part of it is I have my master's in social work from North Carolina Central University, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm really excited to moderate this panel tonight. So again, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you so much. So we're going to dive in tonight. So you, the viewers, are the ones that give me all these great questions. Let's just be real about this. I love your comments. Thank you for your inboxes. Thank you for trusting me to get your topics heard and out here. So I wanted to make sure I use my platform to be able to do that. So one question that I was asked about was, what was my personal journey like in regards to researching my Indigenous and African-American ancestors, whether it be, this question was posed in the sense of your African-American history, or your Indigenous history. It could be both or separate. So to my panelists tonight, who would like to go first to talk about your journey on that?
I can go first.
Steven, come on.
So, you know, my family history, like, it was one of those things that I just kind of took for granted to an extent. And like, you know, most people, like, you know, when you're young, you don't think about the value in having your elders around and kind of walking you through who you are and where you come from and things like that. So, you know, so I grew up knowing my great grandmother in Philadelphia, and she would tell me, like, every time we would go to her house, she would always pull out all these photo albums and just walk us through photos and told us who everybody was and how they're related and where we came from. And so her side of the family descended from former enslaved people in Virginia. And we actually had photos of some of those family members. And so like her grandmother, who was enslaved in Danville, Virginia, she had a photo of her, a picture of her. And that's one of those things that, like, you know, you don't really get the opportunity to see too often. So then, you know, certain things kind of stuck with me even when I was young, even though I didn't take it as seriously as I probably should have. And so as I got older, you know, and we started losing people and things like that, I was still interested in like trying to unpack, you know, some of my history on that line as well as others. And so, you know, it just kind of started as like a slow crawl and then just became almost like a daily thing. And so, and it really started moving more when I went out to Salt Lake City for a job. And while I was out there, you know, they have like the family history, you know, stuff and the research libraries and things like that. And so I really started getting more into like kind of researching. And then I got an opportunity to move to Georgia, and that was where my grandfather, my maternal grandfather's family comes from, or at least part of them do. And so, so I was like, well, here's an opportunity for me to actually like go and then like really like look into records of a side of family I really didn't know much about. And as I started digging that side, they were exceedingly complex group of people, and mixed race individuals that went on and off of records. Sometimes they passed for white. They also were to have had Native ancestry and were also African or of African descent. And and as I was looking up that stuff, it just kind of it would get overwhelming from time to time. And so to take breaks from the gaps on that side of the family, I would look up other branches. And so
Oh yeah.
I was like, I need something easier to look at. So let me go over here where I at least know, certain things. Because a lot of records were lost. Georgia has its own way of handling or had its own way of handling certain records. So I found myself looking more into my Virginia side as a break because Virginia had more comprehensive records and more consistent records. And then on that side of the family, it was just really, like I said, again, kind of complex, but at least it was more documented. So, so I guess to tie it with Native ancestry, like my father's family, they claim both to some extent, but they were very matter of fact about it, and they don't, we identify as African American. We always have, as far as I knew. And as I was doing all this research, my dad was like, he moved back to Virginia and was like, hey, my uncle had this book, had like this family Bible. You might want to look at some of this stuff. He sent me a marriage certificate of his grandparents who were married on what was listed as an Indian reservation at the time in Virginia. And my second great grandmother, who went by the last name Williams, actually went by the name Crowpath. And so we were like, well, where does this? I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense because I was like, it doesn't match up with any of the records I found of them. For as far as I saw, they were always listed as Williams or Willis when she was married, and then there was no reservation there. I was like, well, where's this reservation? This doesn't. It's not the Pamunkey Reservation. It's not, any of the other known reservations that I knew of or that were recognized by the government. So, where is this place? And so, I'm still actively looking, for this information. I'm actually trying to develop that into a research project myself because it's just a weird kind of dead end, but it ties into a lot of communities in Virginia that have, this underdocumentation due to the fact that they intersected and had no problem intersecting with African populations. And so, so yeah, just in a nutshell, we can get into more later, I guess, but that's, my family's all over the place. It was complicated and I'm still looking for a lot of them, so.
Look, we have all been there, I'm sure. Anyone else would like to answer? And thank you, Stephen, for sharing that.
Yeah.
Allison.
So I grew up kind of always knowing where my family came from, which I think is a very unique experience for an African-American person in the United States. My family comes from French and African and also American Indian background. And I remember, a lot of my family still lives on the land that we were enslaved on and then eventually were freed and able to own that land in Cane River. Actually, this week, I think it was premiered, one of the premieres was of a film that one of my family members made called Cane River. So that's where my family is from, is Cane River, on my mom's side. And then on my dad's side, from Opelousas and kind of surrounding smaller towns in Opelousas. So they're both sides of my family are from Middle Louisiana. Most people know about New Orleans, but this is Middle Louisiana. It's not near any kind of bayou or anything like. But they, similar to, sorry, is your name Stephen? Yes, okay. Similar to Stephen, we kept all of the, we were able to track a lot of the history based on Bible records and from church records. And the French, unlike many of the other kind of colonial powers, kept very good records of the people they enslaved because they baptized them. And so we have both the African names and the French names, the Christian baptized names. And so the ancestor that, so I don't know her parents' names. I'm sure there's a record of the parents' names, but the ancestor that is a common ancestor for almost everybody in Cane River is Marie Therese Conquet. And then with her married, meaning she lived with a man and was able, a French man who owned her and eventually freed her. His last name was Matoyer. And so she had 10 children with him, and then another 4 or 5 children outside of that relationship. And the 10 children she was able to buy them out of slavery. And then he gave her something like 300 acres, which she then turned into 3,000 or 30,000 acres of land, which my family still lives on. So that genealogy has been kind of preserved really throughout generations since the mid 1700s. But ironically, I think the connection, even though we always know that we've had connection to Choctaw, that Choctaw and Cherokee blood, apparently have Cherokee blood too. I see a comment about that. I always knew about the Choctaw, and that is not really as much recorded in our records, which is unfortunate because you require records to prove your kind of membership. But on my dad's side, I know that the story was that my great-grandfather married my great-grandmother, who was Choctaw, and my great-grandfather was Haitian. And they her last name was her maiden name was Gobert, which is a French name, but so there was this kind of like mixture of French and Black and American Indian even then. But we all knew that she was Choctaw, long hair. And if you look at pictures, I was looking at pictures, old pictures, and one of my cousins looks like Kimberly. And I'm like, oh my God, even though we're not related. But so, yeah, I mean, we've always had that kind of knowledge that we had Choctaw blood and Cherokee blood, but didn't have any kind of proof of it. But then we recently did a genealogy test over Christmas, well, both my dad and my mom, and it did confirm a connection to Choctaw on both sides, on both my dad and my mom's side. So that's my little story.
Nice. So looking at that whole African, French, Creole people that are basically seeing that mixture there, that's a journey in itself. And one thing I always took pride in it, the times I've been to New Orleans, is to see the beauty of how so many people that are African American have held on to the African piece of culture there. When you go to New Orleans, you can feel it. It's a beautiful vibration there. So yeah, thank you for sharing. Anyone else want to talk about what their journey's been like? Anyone else?
I'll jump in. So it's been a long journey. I've been doing family history research since I was like 20 years old, vigorously. I'm 40 now, so that gives you 20 years, right? 20 years in the game. Most of my family, pretty much all of my family, came out of that Virginia, North Carolina area. And, it was one of those things in which you're given these different oral histories that are passed down, of course. And when you're younger, you may not necessarily know what to do with it. You hear these surnames, you hear these different places, et cetera, but you're ready to go outside and play. You know what I'm saying? That's what it was for me. But then the older I got, I was able to kind of look at some of these pictures and delve a little bit deeper in history. And I saw this one specific picture of what looked to be an African-American man and a white lady. Looked to be, right? That's what it appeared to be. And this had to have been back in, from what a professional person had told me, this was like in the late right after the emancipation of slavery, so the 1880s. And I'm thinking in my head, like, yeah, that probably wasn't supposed to happen. This black guy and this white woman getting married during that time period. So, but I've always heard, of course, that our family was enslaved, which I was able to validate, meet the enslavers of my African American side family, but then also Native as well. And I'm a big fact person. If I can't see where this science points to this being that, I don't divulge deep. I don't delve too deep into it, because how many of us blacks and whites have heard stories of having Native blood, right? But then when you look at certain things, specifically when the Indian Removal Act happened and so many natives were moved from this part of the country westward, you're kind of like, well, how did these connections take place when there wasn't this, like, it wasn't heavy populated in some of these eastern areas after the Indian Removal Act. So what I did was, at one of the family reunions, and I remembered this back in, I think it was like 1992, everyone passed out, well, the adults passed out this literature, and it was a memoir of from my native grandmother, who passed it down to her daughter, which is Pereira Flower Tally, who I have on my shirt. And I literally stumbled upon it while I was going through all these different records, and I looked, and it was her mother's memoir, discussing their journey from Virginia to Tennessee. And in it, she mentions that she was Native and that people thought that she was white. So I'm like, dang, that's dope. You know what I'm saying? And the beautiful thing about that is that her granddaughter, which is my aunt Kate, she just passed 2 years ago. So I was able to get her to do the DNA test, and then that's where the Native, of course, the African side was there, but that's where the Native side it showed. So I'm like, all right, cool. I can actually say that this is a piece of my heritage, and feel comfortable about it. You know what I'm saying? Because I've just lived my life as a black man. So from the African American side, I was able to do a lot of research over the 20 years, meet the enslavers, but the Native side was very difficult. So I was able to get involved in this Jed Match group, which was the Nansman tribe that's in Suffolk, that area. And then when I submitted the DNA, boom, 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 all these matches came back. So I'm like, all right, well, that makes sense, because I was listening to what Kimberly was saying the last time we all got together, and she was like, pay attention to the locale, like pay attention to the location of where these folks were. And then my folks ultimately ended up in Warren County, North Carolina, which, of course, when I look at the connections and how the Nansman, via oral history interviews with people up in the area, how there's that connection that's there as well. Surname Jones, Collins, and of course, connections to surname Mills, just a whole lot of different surname connections. And I'm like, well, this makes sense. You know what I'm saying? Look at the location and recognize that there are more tribes that are out there outside of Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, some of the main tribes that people hear about. And that has been the journey for me in going through slave records and things like that. It is a grueling process through name changes, et cetera, et cetera. It is very difficult, but I feel like I've done a very good job of being able to learn how to manage and do those things and ask the right questions. But the Native piece was difficult. If you're not a person that grew up in that culture, but you just hear different things passed down from oral history, you got to piece all that together and try to figure it out. And it took me a long time, but we finally got it done. So that's been my journey, and it's been rewarding. It's been very rewarding, because now I can pass that down to my folks as well.
That is so awesome. And thank you for sharing it, because it is a journey. It is a process. And like what we're really going to get into a little later is talking about how it feels when you're doing through these documents and things like that, and how the census records are a big situation when it comes to that, when you're doing your family tree. Brianna, Portia, do you have any comments for this question?
I guess I can speak a little bit about how my experience has been, but can I keep it short? I grew up always knowing that I had Indigenous ancestry. I had a full-blooded grandfather that I was like attached to the hip with, and it some of the things and like how he carried himself and like the things that he would talk about, some of the things my grandmother would say would always plant those seeds growing up. But I realized as an adult, when I really started to dive into more so the history side of indigenous culture and the history there that you're not taught, about a lot of the things that happened and the pain that's there. So that would go into why, you know, some of our family members who do have that indigenous identity are slow or almost stubborn to even speak about it. And it got to a point where I was just on my own personal journey with health and, you know, kind of like finding myself to figure out what it was that I wanted to do with my life, because I had all these different avenues pulling me in different directions. And so I started to pick the brain of an aunt, and she put me in touch with an elder cousin that we had. And she was able to give me actual tangible information like forms, documents showing like, you know, posts and photos of like my great great grandmother who was born in the 1800s. And, you know, we always knew names, we always knew who we were, but it was a break in the connection with our extended relatives, because my grandfather, when he grew up and separated from his family, he married um, a Black woman who she had, you know, my grandmother identifies as Black, but, you know, as I'm researching and finding things, I'm realizing that there is possibly something there in her bloodline as well. You know, he moved to Portsmouth and built his own family. And, you know, we would go back and go to powwows and we would, you know, do family reunions, but it wasn't like it is when you actually connect with the tribe and you're there for like a powwow. So I had to know more. It was like this nagging feeling at me. And so I was able to take the information that was given to me by my family members, and I started with Ancestry. And that was how I was able to connect with actual relatives that gave me information that put me in touch with my tribe. So with one of the tribes that I am connected to, and the chief of the tribe actually ended up being a blood cousin of mine. So he was able to corroborate a lot of the information that I had been given. And he also was able to give me more information that I hadn't, you know, been told, and was able to put things in perspective for me of like why my grandfather lived his life the way he did, you know, the choices he made of joining, you know, the Black Mason Lodge and where he lived, insight into like his mother and who she married and things like that, and like how the tribe operated. So it was a frustrating process because it took me, I started 5 or 6 years ago when I really wanted to find proof of things. And it took me close to 6 to 8 months to get that little bit of information that I found. And I've just been building on it ever since and trying to find other family members or other branches of my family. Like my grandmother, you know, she has it on her side, that's my paternal side. And then my mother also has indigenous roots through both of her parents. So it's like this, it's so much there. And that's why my ears perked up when the gentleman before me was speaking, because my last name is Mills. So, and it's like this running thing with us. Like if you're a Mills, 9 times out of 10 we're related, because it's not that many of us. That I don't come across a Mills too often, but when we do, we tend to look alike and tend to be from the same area. So, and they are so elusive to find like any information on, with, you know, the death of people and the transition or marriages and things like that. So that's been my experience so far.
Thank you for sharing that. And I recently, through this project, which I'll talk about a little later as we go into questions, I found out my 4th great grandparents are Mills, David and Jane Mills, from Halifax County area, and migrated to Nash County. And a breakthrough through that, which I'll spoil that a little later for y'all, but stay tuned for that. I'll give y'all a little breakthrough of what I had this weekend that I discovered about my Mills side of the family. Brianna, did you have anything to add to this question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I began my journey when I realized that I really didn't know where I came from. My mom, she was born and raised in Hollister, North Carolina. So She always said that she was reared in a Native community and she was surrounded by the culture. But of course, when she got older, she moved away, met my dad, had me. So I wasn't raised directly in the tribal community. And we only lived about 45 minutes outside of the area. So I would go visit my grandmother and I would get to see glimpse of the culture, you know, during powwows, and getting to see my aunt beat my cousin's regalia and things like that. So I would get to see those things, but I really just didn't understand where it came from or who it came from. So that's what really sparked my interest in researching my Hawasaponi side. And then from there, I realized that I don't know anything about my Virginia side either. And my family is from Roanoke, Virginia. And I have a few family members in Phoenix as well. So, you know, just not understanding who or where it really came from is what sparked my interest. And I've only been researching for about 4 years. But I guess it's a shocker to some because I'm only, you know, a college freshman. So I started my research when I was a freshman in high school. So yeah, but during my free time, I do research my family history and really try to dive in and map out the stories of my ancestors.
I think that is so awesome that you started so young. And again, congrats to you for going to Chapel Hill. You be a freshman this year, make that Tar Heel life. But thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad you talked about Hollister's Powwow, because it is one of my favorite that I've been going to for probably about 19 or 20 years. So definitely one of my favorites. For me, on my journey, everyone, my journey's been a little complex because I already knew pretty much my father's side of the family. I talked about in episode 1 where I found out pretty early on in my life, actually very early, before 5 years old, knowing that his family is Eastern Band Cherokee and West African from the Ivory Coast. Learning the Cherokee language is one of the first languages learned, and then transition into learning more English as well. So it was one of those things where I've culturally always known about that side of the family. Now, my mother's side of the family is the one I'm actually researching currently. I'm researching her paternal side, her father's side of the family, and I'm looking at her grandfather. And so with looking at that, I've been using different websites as well. Some have used like Ancestry and My Heritage DNA. There's so many different sites that you can check out to use. But where I have found some breakthroughs was looking on Ancestry and finding different people that have written little notes or tabs underneath their ancestry trees, and realizing that they were people that lived still in those local communities. And so I started Googling some of the people and found out they had websites, and their websites were genealogy websites. So I want to shout out to genealogists Kianga Lucas and Dolores Williams, because both of those women I've gotten a chance to know virtually a little bit, have truly been a great groundbreaking influence in my genealogy research. Both of them have researched extensively certain members of my family when it comes to the Mills and Richardsons and Evans and all that side of my family, from my mother's grandfather's family. There really is a lot of research. So, my great grandfather, he's a Lucas, but his mother is a Mills. So starting with her, because a lot of Native communities like to start with the women. They look at where the women were, how many children they had, who they married, and working your way back to wherever land they lived on, like Frederick mentioned earlier. So with that journey, my big spoiler alert breakthrough was this Sunday. I was able to go visit a family cemetery. It's a small cemetery in Nash County, and I was able to go visit it, and that's where I found a large portion of my Mills family relatives that I have only just seen through documents online. Now in real space, I was able to go and see actual where they have been buried in their headstones, and verifying the dates and names and spellings and everything. So that was a good full circle moment in my research. And right now I'm in the late 1700s on her family side, because they too, like Frederick, migrated from Virginia down through Warren, and then mine went into Halifax and Nash County as well. So that's kind of been my journey. the short long of it has been my journey with that. So I've been doing that for about the past year for that side of the family. So I'm really excited to see some new beginnings. So yeah. So okay, cool. Let's get into question 2.
Wait,
All right.
so did I miss this, or are you and Portia related? Did I miss that?
It's starting to sound like we might be. So
We just might be. I said I was gonna connect with Portia again to start ask her some names, see if we are the comparison.
we was talking, and I'm thinking like if we can trace it back, we may end up being double related because there's some names in there that are on both sides of my family.
Okay. And I am like double, triple related to some people that I have to also highlight Brianna that I met through her group that we'll talk about a little later, the Holowassaponi Ancestry DNA group. I met some cousins in there and found out we were related like 2-3 times. So yeah. I want to shout out Brianna for that group she's created because I was able to join that group and find some extra family. So lots of cousins. And then Frederick also shares family lineage since episode 1. So see how the
wait, all y'all cousins.
Right.
Oh, like great. I'm never gonna have kids.
I know, right? We're not gonna ever have kids because this is just like cousin on cousin on cousin.
Yeah, I hate to throw out there too. My grandmother's family, they're Richardsons.
Oh,
so I don't know. And they're from Virginia, so I don't know. But then again, there's like, like I told you before, there's a million of them. So
yeah,
that's why I say I've never married anybody from Louisiana.
To all the single men in Louisiana, I'm sorry. Allison says no. But yes, those are some fun facts, guys. You never know. You might end up on a panel with your cousins and not even know it. And next, that's the journey of genealogy, especially for these southern states. You start seeing a lot of people, families share large families. People were farming back then, so people had lots of children. I mean, most of my family had 15 plus children, some as many as 34. So, I mean, it has ranged to a large number of family members. So, yeah. So. Cousins on cousins on cousins here. When did y'all realize the significance of surnames when you were researching your indigenous family members? So, their connection to tribal communities or reservations if they're federally recognized, state recognized, usually tribal communities. But what was the surname significance in your research? Anyone can jump in on
that. I can speak on what I know. So I always knew that because, like you were saying about how your grandmothers usually had so many children because they, were farm owner. They were landowners and they had farms and things like that. So it was important to be able to identify people by their surnames because you had so many different marriages. And like if you ever connect with your tribe, that's like the first thing that they ask you when you step on a powwow or some type of social. They're like, who are you people? Like, and they want to know surnames, and that's how they're able to connect you. And if you can at least have that, like for the Maharan, I'm connected through the Lewises. So my great-great-grandmother was a Lewis. She married a Newsome, and that's how they were able to determine I'm a direct descendant of her, Sally. So that was like the first thing the chief asked me when I got him on the phone. It was the first thing people asked me when I stepped at the powwow, and they were walking around like, okay, well, you related to a Melton, you're related to this person. So surnames are super important, and they help you zero in on like your clan. And it's important to be able to do that because when you start going through these census documents, you'll realize how much of the data that you collect is going to be skewed. It's like a small piece to a jigsaw puzzle. And like, for instance, my grandmother owned a ton of land and some of it was farmland, and she had a lot of people living with her under, when you would look at her name, she was the head of household, and then you would have all these people under her name. And I was thinking like, okay, my grandmother then had 22 children out of 2 marriages. But then it turns out that, yeah, she had a lot of children from her second marriage, but her first marriage, not so many. It was just, she had so many people living in the house with her. And they were either hired help or they were, farm hands and things like that. And they may have not necessarily been of relation to you until a certain point, maybe if they were like married into the family. So the surnames are significant for helping you being able to pinpoint information for like your direct relation to people, and then helping you be able to differentiate like a family that may not be of relation to you. They could be of the same tribe, but or they can just not be related to you at all, because you had, you know, in Virginia, you know, you had a lot of indigenous people freeing enslaved Africans or other enslaved indigenous people that were of no relation to them. My grandmother was taken in by Tuscarora elders. So because her parents were murdered when she was younger, but she was not related to the elders who raised her. So that was like important to be able to find out that information when you were looking at documentation. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of times it does get tricky when you're talking about, especially when you're getting back into the mid to early 1800s, where you're looking at people were enslaved or sharecropping or hired help, indentured servants. When you're getting into all that cluster, seeing multiple people in a dwelling, as you might see it on Ancestry.com, you're trying to figure out how do all these people connect. And sometimes some people married, had children with one another, or they just might have been friends to the family, or they may have been people that were in a space of servitude to whoever was the head of household. So I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing I'll touch on in a little bit after the rest of the comments come through from everyone is about how the surnames connect back to the plantation. We're going to go there. We
Um, what I on the DNA test that we did, I think it's important to match the records, the stories, and the DNA. You can't just, a lot of people, that's where they start, is with the DNA test, because they just don't have any other information. And you just have to be very careful about the DNA test, because they're not all made the same. They don't all tell you the same results. They're not all measuring the same DNA aspects of DNA. And so, for example, on ours, there was like a relative that was very close, and he kind of, they said his racial composition was something like 50% white or more than that. But he was like a really close relative, and we had never heard of this person. And you know, so then we have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, like how close are they, what, because it makes these connections for you based on prediction of percentage. And so you just have to like be careful about that. And I think for us, I mean, surnames were obviously important, but they can be confusing because we had a lot of cross marriage or intermarriage. And so it'll be the same surname for both people. So, that's something else that we had to decipher, is just, and then also because we have a common ancestor, it's especially, I'm just talking about in the Cane River area, Natchitoches, Louisiana, which is also an American Indian word, right? Natchitoches. The sometimes we will have a common ancestor of Conque, but the branches have branched out so much now that there's like thousands of us, right? And so you may even have the same surname, but then they're like maybe 10 cousins away, like they're 10 I guess relations away. So then it's like, we're related, but we're not real related, so it's kind of, that's the part, that's the interesting. I don't know if that's unique to us because we have been able to trace our family so extensively that we're able to trace the branches out so far. But that's just another thing to consider as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that about the intermarrying. So some people watching, depending upon your tribe and tribal communities or reservation, you might see people with same exact last names that intermarried. Many times in my family, people would say things like, "Oh, it's just not the same bloodline. It's a different set of XYZ family member. And or surname. And then you're thinking to yourself, but you live less than 10 miles or 20 miles from each other. It's a different set. But then, of course, what do? You don't question elders. You just roll with it until you can prove otherwise. So when you get older and you research things, you start to realize how a lot of people in smaller rural communities did intermarry, and there'd be a core of a certain amount of family names you keep seeing over and over again in certain tribal communities or reservations. So thanks for
Sorry. Yeah, and just one more thing to add is that to that point, there's a lot of first names. So like my family, the first name that's really common is Marie Therese. And you're gonna see like 20 or 30 Marie Therese in our family. So then it's like, which one is which? And they all have some similar surname. So just trying to figure out the generations and when they were born and then who they were connected to, because you don't know which Marie Therese is which. So that's another thing.
That's a good fun fact. Anyone else want to comment on this question?
Yeah, I'll jump on. For the African American side, you have to, it's very important to follow the white folks, because that's, if your family was enslaved, that's the surname, of course, that they took. I was able to find literally it was about 4 months ago, 3 different surnames that my Lao family had taken, were given prior to us coming to the point to where we're at right now. It was first Speed, Speed, out of North Carolina. Then they were sold to a slave trader by the last name of Hunt, in Tennessee. And then from Hunt, my grandfather was sold to a man by the name of Lau. And even then, it went from Lyles to Lyle. And even at that point, and even like the 60s and 70s, and even now, some people have the S at the end of it and some people don't. One of the names that was pretty much a constant was my Talley family out of Virginia, who then settled in Warren County and was in Warren County for a long time with their enslavers before coming to Tennessee. But that's because they were owned by that family, or enslaved by that family rather, since the 1700s. And then from the native side with the Jones and the Collins, what was able to kind of keep a stronghold on that was that I was able to look and see that those two last names were, familiar. Those were two last names connected to the Nansemond tribe. And in the 1870 census, at the first census after the emancipation of slavery, of course, that names were actually put on there. My grandmother, Isabella Jones, was living with her husband, Amos Talley, and they had it was like 8 or 9 Collins that was also living with them. And the birthplace of their parents were all there in Virginia. So I was able to kind of, it all made sense, being that my grandmother was from Virginia, last name Jones, all the Collins were from Virginia, and they all eventually trickled down together. You know what I'm saying? And even when I go back to Warren County, which is pretty frequently from the African American side, when I look at some of these names, Plumbers, Boyds, Tallies, like all these different names, a lot of them are buried in our family cemetery in Tennessee. So like those migrations and those families stayed, of course, closely connected via the enslaver, as well as just via however they were able to communicate back then, and eventually end up in the same space. Because all those Collins that I was telling you about in Virginia, that came from Virginia, I couldn't find them anywhere prior to the 1870 census in the same town that these folks were in. So we have a very unique way of communicating and getting word to family members like no other. You know what I'm saying? And it all worked out. So surnames are very, 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 very important.
I'm glad you brought that up, because similar thing with, I always say, look at the names and then you can start tracing back. And I think that's exactly right. You start looking at where you're looking at those different documents and different things in census, which we'll talk about that in a few. But I'm so glad you shared that. And thank you for breaking it down that way, because I think that's going to help a lot of people watching tonight. Anyone else want to make a comment on this subject?
Yeah, if I can jump in real quick. The other thing I feel like with surnames, at least for my end of things, it's always been kind of the tricky part, because like sometimes like we have family members that stuck with these surnames and you would see them as a constant, and it almost makes me wonder like, um, what was the etiquette or the practice in terms of acquiring the various surnames, especially when you're talking about African American lineage, because a lot of times we say like it was the slave owner's name and it was just given to or put on this individual. But in my instance, I'm seeing like a mix of that. So like we had, for instance, one of the stories that my grandmother used to always tell was like she and her mother would go down. They went down to Virginia one time on a trip, and they met somebody, and they were like, like my great grandmother said, she was like, yeah, my family was from down here, and my grandmother or my mother lived here and stuff. My grandmother did, and she was like, well, what was her name? And she was like, oh, well, her last name was Hubbard. And she was like, were they tobacco picking Hubbards or cotton picking Hubbards? Those were two different families. So that to me kind of felt like, well, that's the name being imprinted on a bunch of people based off of who owned them and who kind of regulated that land. However, on my grandfather's side of the family, on the Georgia side, we had like all kinds of things happening over there. So like his mother was last name Pettigrew, and that was directly from the person that last owned our family, but also was the patriarch in a sense of that family. So he was the white owner of the family, but he was also the father of my second great grandfather. And he also owned many other slaves, but only we kept that last name. So any Pettigrew that you were running across that was Black in Virginia was somehow tied into that family. And so I was like, well, we're passing on these names through lineage in some instances, but then also just kind of blankly just dumping them on people in another way. So it's like there seemed to have been like some sort of practice or general practice that may have varied region to region or person to person. And I feel like there's something to that. And then even like my great grandmother in Georgia, her mother went by 3 different surnames. One of them, I'm speculating, was a former married name, but she went by Julia White, and then Julia. Before that, she was Julia Jones, and at one point she was Julia Hunt. So it was like, well, which one is the name, and how are we going to be researching these records when we're looking for? How do you find somebody with a relatively generic name like Julia, and then a common name like Jones, or a fairly common but name like Hunt, but anyone that you could find could be her. So it's like, well, how are you kind of piecing that together? So for me, anyway, it seemed like surnames kind of fell into this weird space of like they were very helpful or they were very not helpful, and I had to find all these other context clues and then roundabouts to kind of connect the dots.
And I think that's how the journey is with surnames. It's like either you find, when you have a family member that has such a common name that could be just like Jane Smith, and then you're trying to research Jane Smith, and there's thousands of Jane Smiths, and you're trying to break it down to find out the year and death and location, and trying to find context clues about Jane Smith to break it down. I'm so glad you brought that up, Stephen, because that's so true. Allison, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say that the other thing that happened a lot was that Black folks would change their name so that they would get rid of the enslaved name and adopt a new name. A lot of Black folks have the last name Brown or Freeman or Friedman for that reason. My family has a very unique last name, Balthazar. And that's not a French name. It's not an African name. It's like, where did that come from? And this is not confirmed, but this is a theory that has come from my family that one of our ancestors was the son of a man named Balthazar Dupree. And his name was like Jonathan or something like that. I don't remember the original name, but his name was Jonathan, and he did not have a last name, but he was a Black son of this white enslaver. And so he took the last name Balthazar because that was his father's first name. And then Balthazar is one of the 3 wise men. So that's kind of a symbol of our family now is this Black wise man from biblical figure. So, it's kind of interesting too, just thinking about how we create our own legacy and our own, like now there's all these Balthazars that exist, and that there's no other Balthazars in the world except for that exists within. So in some ways that's helpful, because if you have the last name Balthazar, I know you my cousin, because there's nobody else in the world with that last name. Yeah.
But I think that's so helpful too, because in my family, they would take your last name and make it your middle name. So like my mother always went by Willisteen Lucas Knight. So that Lucas never left. It stayed right there. And it was a thing of like a lot of people in her family, they didn't have traditional middle names. They would have the actual last name of their family member, especially the women. They always kept their father's name. So as their middle name. But yeah, anyone else want to chime in on this one before we go to the next question?
I just had a quick thing too. But I noticed when I was looking up documents for my great great grandmother, and I don't know this to be confirmed, but my theory is that she couldn't speak a whole lot of English. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of documents that I saw her sign in her earlier years of life were always signed with an X. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until like later in her life where she started to actually pen her name. And even on the census documents, I don't think that it was something that, she was able to tell them like, this is my name, because it would have all different types of spelling, or she would be at different positions within the household until it got to a certain point where she was like head of household. And so for people that are going to trace their genealogy and they find documentation, be prepared for things like that, because that was frustrating, because I'm like, okay, they're saying this is her or this is her signature, but then you pull up the actual like photograph of that document and it's just like an X or whatever that relative used to, sign a document.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that point up, because there were many of our ancestors that did not speak English and were not able to write English as well or read English. So you had a lot of times of people that would use just maybe an initial or an X or some type of symbol to sign as their signature. Yeah. Brianna.
Also, real quick, sorry to interrupt, but that was also a way for when census takers went around and they took those censuses and they saw that a person couldn't read or write, that was like the predatory lending that we have seen here in the recent years. They preyed on those individuals. If you didn't know how to read or write, better believe, and if you owned land, if you owned it, right, they were coming back because whatever they presented in front of you, you wouldn't be able to understand. And if they're just they're reading it to you, telling you what this is, and they just say, oh, well, you just put an X here, then that's considered a signature, of course. And then you have property that's taken away. Or, you signed up for something that you didn't necessarily know what it is that you were signing up for. That's how one of my grandfathers had a whole boatload of land taken away because he couldn't read or write. But his wife, this lady, she could, but the census taker wouldn't allow her to speak for him because why? She was a woman. So they came back like 6 months after they came to the census taker came to the house. And this was in like the 1920s. And all of that land was taken per the document that he wrote the X on. So it goes really, really deep. The censuses are so important with regards to understanding how people have been marginalized and oppressed. And so it's just very important that we pay attention to those different aspects of things. And then when you see if land was taken or if this had happened or that was happened, a lot of it was based on an individual's level of education and what it is that they could do with regards to how these census takers were being predators on Black and brown folks.
And I'm glad you brought that up because we are going into the census in just a quick second. And I would like to say we had from the comments, Mr. Emerson Foster says his grandmother was a plumber from Warren County. So might be another additional cousin joining the crew, y'all. So that's there. But Brianna, did you have anything, or else I'll move on to the census?
Like everyone has been saying, surnames can get really confusing and complex, especially when there's intermarrying. Particular for the Holowassaponi tribe, a lot of surnames I see are Richardson, Reed, Rudd, Johnson, Lynch, Silver, Copeland, and my aunt, she's actually a Mills. So those are some common surnames in the tribe. And to see those in records and also as common surnames among tribal members today, that kind of allows me to understand more of my connection to the tribe. But also through those surnames, particular, I think the Richardson line, I was able to connect back to the Bass family in Virginia, who were Nanzamon, and I was able to see that they have descendants who are Holowassaponi, Maharan, Okanichi Saponi, and Lumbee. So yeah, through those surnames, I was able to find all of that out, and it's really been interesting to see how I've been connected to the tribe for centuries.
I'm glad that you brought it up. Abraham Bass was a well-known enslaver in Virginia. That is where you hear about the Nazmon people talk a lot about the Bass family. For my family, Abraham Bass fathered a child with an enslaved woman. Now, in the records that I found, there's been different perspectives I've seen. Some have said that she was indigenous, some have said that she was African American or African. So it hasn't been necessarily displaced her life, but I do know with his will and testament, which is a key, everyone, if you can find the will and testaments of the enslavers, the slave owners, then you will find that they sometimes willed land and property to certain people that they enslaved. And a lot of times we saw historically when they enslaved people and gave them certain amounts of freedoms or lands and in their demise, then typically they may have fathered children with people. So that's where you start to see a lot of those things going on. And so for me, the surnames, like you said, Brianna, these very traditional surnames you hear in my family, Evans, Richardson, Mills, all these names out of these 3 core counties that all derive from Virginia, it starts to all come together as you're starting to realize like these names do give you kind of keys and breadcrumbs to try to find your way in that journey. So everyone hold tight. You're going to be on your little journey, your genealogy world, trying to find those names and connecting the dots. But guess what? When you find certain ones, you'll hit a button. You'll be like, whoa, it opens up a whole chart of people that you just never even knew you would expect. So yeah, so that's definitely one. So speaking of the census, we are in that 2020 census year now. So people, for those of you, I've already done my census. I don't know if everybody else has had a chance to do it yet, and then there's people that choose not to, which is your own right. But there's a lot of people that choose to participate in the census 2020. This video is not sponsored by the census, so I just want to put that out there. But y'all can call me.
But, yeah, I was gonna say, but they could give some money if they feel like it.
You can make a charitable donation towards our powwow, yes. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about the Census 2020. And I know tonight we talked a little bit of how those records have helped us in our genealogy journey in Ancestry.com and other databases and things like that. But I kind of want to go into like, what are your thoughts on the current census and what that means to you when it comes to identification? Because now we can self-identify a lot more closer than our ancestors could. So yeah, how y'all feeling about the census? Anybody?
I mean, it's important. I mean, when you sit back and you look at how it was utilized back then, you didn't really have any say-so over it. When you go back and you look at the research, like for some of my family members, you have in the 1870 census, everyone's mulatto. 1880, everybody black. Skip to 1890 because it's not one mostly. There are a couple of them out there for certain places. 1900, then you got a couple of them black and then a couple of them mulatto. But they're the exact same people. You know what I'm saying? So, in which that makes it frustrating in itself with regards to being able to, kind of hunker down and get some definites. But, if you follow the trail long enough, you'll be able to confirm it for yourself. It's just very meticulous. You have to be very meticulous about it. But I think it's an opportunity for us to continue doing what our ancestors did with regards to providing as much information as possible, because hopefully at some point in time when we're gone, and I'm not rushing that, knock on wood, somebody's going to look up us. Somebody's going to want to be able to find information about us. And the census and death records and military records, et cetera, old newspapers, those are very pertinent pieces of information that help us in completing this research. Specifically death records. If you're able to get a death certificate that has a mother and the father of somebody, or look at the informant or the place where that person's buried, that's like a jackpot, specifically if you can go back to the 1800s or early 1900s. So the census is very important. It's important with regards to where government funding is supposed to go. And I say that like that, air quotes, supposed to go. It's important from an educational standpoint. So we have to have it. I fill it out, but I don't disrespect anyone who doesn't. Everyone has their own reasons. But I fill it out because I hope that eventually someone wants to look me up and follow the same trails that we have.
Thank you.
I'll piggyback. Oh, okay.
Oh, go ahead,
Portia.
Yeah.
I'll piggyback off what Frederick was saying. That's exactly where I was going to go with it, as far as, at some point down the road, someone is going to look us up. You never know what's going to happen over the next, few years that could change how we research information, or say, you get one or two people in the family that gets disconnected from their family, or someone doesn't have children. You want people to be able to build on the work that, like, we're doing. I personally wouldn't want my children to have to go through what I went through to try to reconnect themselves. However, the census has been huge in me being able to find proof of a lot of the things I need to be able to become an enrolled member of my tribe. So, like, say I don't do my part and provide that same thing for, like, say, them going forward, or their children's children, they won't have much of a reference to start from if I don't keep connecting those dots. But even aside from just, the genealogy standpoint, I think people don't realize that the census also helps you now. So, if you live in a neighborhood or an area that is disadvantaged, that lacks funding and resources for certain programs, schooling, libraries, bus stops, those are the things that are going to help your elected officials, or an argument you may take to, like, a town hall meeting saying, I live in a new development, there's no bus stops, or there's no library within a 15-mile radius of this new development. Like, those are the things that the Census Bureau help change if you identify, who you are, the demographic, programs that they need to bring to your area based off the demographic that's in that area. So I think people need to they need to recognize that when they think about the census now and today and how it affects us individually. And then two, I just lost my train of thought. It helps with that, but then too, the whole Walter Peckler thing with the Woodland Indians and the indigenous people of the East Coast. We were reclassified. A lot of indigenous people were reclassified as Negro because they were darker, and it was because they wanted to be able to enslave you. So there are a lot of people that do not know that they are either full-blooded or have a significant lineage of indigeneity. And so for me, that's it's like an intentional thing. Like, when I do this census, I am correcting them as who I am. Like, I'm not who you have told me to be all these years. Like, I know who I am, and it needs to be corrected. Like, it sits on a part of me that makes me so angry that I knew my grandfather was a full-blooded indigenous man, but his birth certificate said Negro and his death certificate said Negro. And I'm like, so that's why I fill the census out every year, or when it comes out, that's why I do it.
Thank you.
That's interesting because even though I've always known those parts of me, I never really felt like I could. Even though I know theoretically I am allowed to, I never felt like it was okay for me to mark off American Indian or even French. I mean, I was just like, I'm Black. So it doesn't feel right to me. But so I think there's there's also politics behind it, right? So if you select multiple categories, then that a lot of times will, and I'm coming from a perspective of a researcher who works with census data every day. What happens is we drop those people from the analysis, which is really sad and unfortunate because we know that they are very important and oftentimes undercounted, right? And I know I'm undercounted because I don't even check it off, right? But what ends up happening is if someone checks multiple racial categories, it's so few people who check that off, although that number is growing, that it's difficult to do an analysis with them. And so a lot of times people will just drop them from the analysis and just look at Black, just look at white, just look at Hispanic and Asian, even though those categories are arbitrary and made up too. So I've, in some ways, I've politically have also just decided to check Black because I know it would count more in some crazy way. So I don't know. That's an interesting thought, about, and like I don't know. I wonder how American Indian people would feel if I were to check off American Indian, knowing that I didn't grow up in the culture, even though I have the ancestry and I actually even have records of people who are connected to that culture. I just, for some reason, I feel like it's not okay for me to do it. And maybe that's because I've been told that it's not okay, but yeah.
I think that's a great question. That's something we're gonna have to pose out to our viewers. And I'm in a lot of different groups that I might have to pose that question to see how some of them feel. I know that can be a very touchy subject for people because some people feel like, well, we grew up in these certain communities or reservation areas, if they're federal recognized, and we feel this certain way. Like with my father's family, many of them grew up in Cherokee, North Carolina. So a lot of them would feel a certain type of way if I did not check that box, even though I did live in Wilson, North Carolina, on the whole other side of the state, from the west to the east. And I don't have a necessary connection to it, but feel like, no, how are we ever going to have an accurate count if you don't count? So, so it goes both ways. And then there's, I'm sure, some people that may have the opinion of, well, if you didn't grow up in the community and you're not necessarily a member of the tribe, which we all know these things are political, like we said before, even the terms of race are political. Those are coming from colonization. We're not going to give y'all the history lesson tonight, but please join in looking it up yourselves about race and gender and all these things that were created in certain ways and instances to oppress people many, many centuries ago. So I think and I've always been told this, and many natives have told me the same. They have grown up on reservations from the West to the East Coast. I grew up saying, if you feel you are Native and you've connected with the Creator and with nature the way that you have, it's something innate in you that you know. It's not about a classification. It's not about a census record, blood quantum, travel card, CBID, degree of Indian blood. It's not about all these political things that are used to control land and income and keep people on reservations and in poverty. It's not about these types of things. It's about what is that true innate feeling within you, because so many people were removed from all this land is Native land. And so many people have been pushed over, removed, transferred, pushed this way all over it. So it causes a lot of hurtfulness when you're going through the processes of that. So I'm glad you brought it up. I'm gonna ask a couple groups about that with the census, how they feel about the people that know they're of Indigenous descent, but not necessarily grew up in the community. How do you feel about them checking the box of saying that they want to check Black and Indigenous or Indigenous, whatever. So yeah, thanks, Allison. Good question. Anyone else have a comment about the census before we move to the next question?
It seems to me like the classification stuff we're talking about is like the conflict of colonized ways of being or a state of colonization in various ways. And I mean, in theory, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to put white on a census record. Matter of fact, I have more verification, more documentation proving that I have white ancestry directly from Europe. I can show you the house that they live in Ireland if you want, you know, but
France, I know where they lived in France. I got
right.
the address and everything.
But there's something socialized, and something, you know, just in general that we feel like we don't want to do. But there's something socialized that we also perpetuate by drawing those lines of distinction. You know, I mean, if you look at all of us, we're different shades. You know, we have different backgrounds, but we all identify as Black to some degree. And so, just in that, there's a colonized state of being that we're kind of subscribing to. And I think when it comes to indigenous identity, you know, I try not to set foot in those waters too much because I feel like it's speaking out of turn in many ways. But my observation seems to be that there's this constant conflict between, you know, culturally native and politically native, and what does that mean for different people? And I mean, and when you have people who have inhabited both spaces simultaneously, and then other people who've only inhabited one space or had to give up both spaces because of their Blackness, I think you kind of run into these really complex issues. And I'm curious as to how the census plays out when you have, you know, these kinds of ways of thinking conflicting with each other, and then also when you have active misinformation out here that kind of steers people in directions that they shouldn't be going in terms of, you know, the like there's no slave ships, there were never people, like we were never from Africa, like these kinds of concepts that also kind of permeate, you know, the internet, and people kind of subscribe to because they're popular or they're viral or they're being orchestrated in some capacity, and all of that kind of falling into itself. So it kind of makes the racial classification so arbitrary and so random that, you know, the most you can get out of is like the novelty information that could hit or miss, you know. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of at least my perspective on it. It's kind of up in the air. Like I'm still kind of you know, I don't know how we identify with that, or how do we kind of reconcile that.
It's a touchy subject because for so long it was either you were white or you were Black. That the Indian has been erased, and that we have taken the savage, quote unquote, out of the native and made him civilized. And now he has been indoctrinated into white culture. And so that's when we start hearing a lot of terminology of seeing, or even documentation where you'll see people who are European that are paying to be claimed as native to be able to have access to land and to different benefits of the government, because you have government agencies that were created for that. But that, again, is another history lesson y'all have to look up because we're getting the time. But Brianna, did you have anything on census? And if so, if not, I'm going to move on to question the last one. Did you have anything? Okay. Oh, there you go. Oh, did she say no? Nothing on census? Okay. Okay, good deal. Well, our last question for tonight, I did see a really interesting question from our viewer, Danita King. How does funding get allocated when you choose more than one when it comes to the census? Did anyone have one comment or two about that, about how it gets allocated? I'm not sure how it gets allocated. That's something I have to pin and get back to you, Danita, about that one, about how the funding gets allocated. Our last question tonight, everyone. What tips or advice would you offer to our viewers who are just starting out on their genealogy research journey? Oh, these viewers. Yes, we want to let them know how they can get started, and I'll let everyone take it away, and then we'll get ready to close on out for tonight. Anyone have any comments on ways to get started when you're first beginning?
I guess I'll first. So I would definitely suggest setting up your Ancestry DNA account, even if you haven't used one of their DNA kits. And from there, create a family tree and just start adding names. Even if you're unsure about the date they were born, if that's actually their last name or first name, or even the date that they passed away, I would still add them to the tree. And if you have the opportunity, still talk to your family members. A lot of the historians in my family have passed away, so no one really ever talked about it. So that has definitely made the journey a little bit more difficult for me, being, you know, the young person in my family and not knowing any a lot of oral history. So definitely speak to family members that are still here with you today. And lastly, I would say join groups like mine, the Holowasponi Ancestry and DNA group, just in case you can, you know, find a family member. And lastly, I want to refer you all to the, let me see, the familysearch.org database. And they have a lot of free records that you can actually download. And that database has been really beneficial in my research journey.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And like I said earlier, in case you viewers missed it, I really am thankful for Brianna having her group, the Holowasponi Ancestry DNA group, because I was able to locate some new cousins in there and find some people that matched to me. And I have not yet taken my DNA test, but I will soon. But I've been doing my genealogy kind of work when it comes to the paperwork piece of it, like she was talking about. But I was able to find some family there. So groups that you might join, you might be able to locate some common family members. All right. Anyone else have a comment about how you started out with your journey? Any tips for anybody watching?
Yeah, I'll say, just like Brianna had mentioned, if you're able to get some oral history, every time that you're around an elder, record it. I mean, these cell phones, you know, you can record that information and come back to it later on. It's just always great to have. Be very intentional when you're around family, such as holidays. If you celebrate Thanksgiving, if you celebrate Christmas, if you have family reunions, make sure that you reach out to some of the elderlies ahead of time and say, hey, while we're there, do you mind if I steal away about 30 minutes of your time? Just want to ask you this, ask you that. Death records are huge. Like I mentioned earlier, if you can get a hold of some death records, birth records for African American history, follow the white folks. Specifically, if that surname is concentrated in a specific area, 9 times out of 10, there is a connection between those families. You know, and again, it's one of those things that's a grim reality from an African American standpoint, and also indigenous individuals that were enslaved as well. These names were given, right? And so, you know, they've had to come from somewhere. So those are some tips that I have. Census records are huge, very, very big. And if you like me, I like going to the hometowns or the towns to where my ancestors, where they were enslaved, or just places that they were heavily populated. And I like going to the courthouse to look at the records. I call ahead and see if they can pull that out. Going to the libraries. A lot of libraries have have genealogy sections, and you'll see family books that are there. Even if it's not an African American or a Native American family that's left something there, if they're white. Then look at that book, because if you share the same surnames, then there's probably going to be something there that can be of assistance to you. And wills, probate records, like all the, I know I'm saying a lot, but it is a lot in order for you to be able to get what you need. Newspapers.com is very large, is very huge, specifically for Black folks. If I type in a Black person's name, I always, depending on how far back I'm going, I always make sure to add colored or Negro in there as well, so I can be as precise as possible, because those names were often, that's what was used. If I'm looking up an enslaver, I also type in the word slave, sale, or any of those type of things, because you need to be as precise as possible. So yeah, it's a lot. It really is. It's a marathon. It's definitely not a race. So practice patience and just process of elimination. Look at the dates that these individuals were born. Look at the dates that they passed. Another place is Find a Grave, is another place to where you can possibly find some good information. Again, that's Find a Grave. You can Google that, and that can be as of assistance as possible. So yeah, a lot of different modalities to get to where you need to be. Oh, and then also real quick, things like this is huge. Kimberly and I, over the past couple of weeks, have been able to find multiple connections between our families or in our family. And if it wasn't for that, she may not she may not even have the ancestry kit that she got coming in the mail, because I linked her up with an individual that we shared ancestry with. So it's just research, networking with people that love this kind of stuff, just like everyone that's on this panel. That's what helps the most.
Yes, thank you so much, cousin. So finding out, I have so many new cousins I'm finding out. So anyone else want to comment on tips for your beginning journey with genealogy? Anyone else?
I would say be careful of landmines. There's some family history that some people don't want uncovered.
I don't talk about that.
Yeah. And then there's also what I found interesting, and then going back to I do work in health disparities and health equity, and a lot of my family do not want to talk about health, or health conditions that they've had. But sometimes that can be like medical records can also be, obviously they won't be available until a person is dead for several years. Because I think even after they've died, medical records are sealed for quite a while. But that can be a source, maybe even. But yeah, just be careful of landmines, extra children, kind of floating around there that you find, extra relationships. So that's one thing to be careful of. But I also agree that finding Facebook groups. I have a family group me. Encourage your family to kind of create those groups and to start having conversation. My family has started sharing stories and pictures that I've never seen before. And so that's just a way to get connected, but also to just get some information. And so that way you don't have to necessarily wait for a family gathering, especially now during COVID, that some of those may not even happen for a while. So I would encourage creating Facebook groups and group me's to just start having those conversations.
Yes, thank you for mentioning about the landmines. You never know. You might find out some very interesting things. And from a social work perspective, my thing is you might find some things that are hurtful, because there's a lot of pain that comes sometimes in the past, especially when you start getting deep and deep into like times when people were enslaved, or people were we are very much extremely discriminated against in certain areas of life, of course, but to the extremities that it was with our ancestors. When you're getting into the Jim Crow and Emancipation era, Reconstruction, when you're getting back to the enslavement times, you might find and see some things that could cause some slight trauma. So take your time with it. Don't feel pressured that you have to continue on in that journey if that causes you any kind of harm, and feel, or any family member any kind of harm, because it's not about that. It's a process of getting to know where you come from and who you are. So anyone else have any tips before we close out?
Yeah. Well, a couple things. So first, I would say, you don't necessarily have to use Ancestry or like do like any of these kind of paid subscriptions. You could just write it down on a piece of paper, and just keep a booklet, keep notes. Only because, I know some people get wary of providing information, to third parties and stuff like that. And not to rail against Ancestry, because they helped me out before, so I'm not gonna go at it too hard. But at the same time, I understand people's reservations about submitting information that's personal or private to a third party organization or a private business. So just at least just write it down, and just start from yourself and work back. You don't jump all the way back here and start looking for whomever. Start from places that you absolutely know, people that you know specifically, their first and last names, birth and deaths, and start from there and go backward. And also, I think the idea of, in keeping with the theme of genealogy, we did at ARC, we had a roundtable discussion just this past Saturday discussing some of the mental health considerations. So not to plug too hard, I hope you don't mind, but if you go to thecenter.org, we also have a video with genealogist Shelley Baxter, as well as therapist Angela M. Hawk. And they talk about, some of the mental health considerations and also some other tips in terms of how do you get started doing genealogy as well. So those are some of the things I would, and also another landmine thing is to never assume that you have the right person, and never assume that your record is correct or that somebody else's records are correct. You could always, sometimes you can find people same first and last names, same death years in some cases, some same birth years in some cases, and it's a completely different individual. And so, really, vet all of your sources, and don't be afraid to also spiral out and kind of look up siblings, because sometimes you can find other stuff through siblings and uncles and aunts and cousins. You'll find stuff that kind of loops back into your family. So even if you feel like you're going too far out, don't worry. You can find stuff that can possibly loop you back into information you're really looking for. So those would be my considerations.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. And I did watch the video Saturday, and y'all check it out. It is on their YouTube channel. It was awesome. I got some great genealogy tips from watching it, and it was amazing to just take a look at that on Saturday. So thank you for sharing. Anybody else want to comment before we close out with our closing out statements about genealogy tips? All right, well, I will give mine real quick. Is that I did use Ancestry.com. I will say that I have seen many people use other sites like 23andMe, they've used for DNA purposes, or African Ancestry.com. That's a newer one that's been out, Dr. Gina Page. And actually, I've had some dialogue with her in my DM. Shout out to her. She is really awesome and doing some great work there. She's also from Howard University area. So, yep. I know you're on mute, so they didn't hear you. But for those bison out there, but yeah, there's some great sites like that that really break down genetically. And then you have, like I said, the two genealogists that I mentioned earlier, they have some great blog sites. Sites.rootsweb.com is Dolores Williams, and then NativeAmericanRoots.com is Kianga Lucas. So NativeAmericanRoots.wordpress.com. Her research has been awesome. And so I pride these two ladies because they have done an extensive amount of work on people that are personally in my family that made it a lot easier for me to connect the dots with comparing other sites together. Find a Grave was great. I will say with Find a Grave, just make sure with land location in rural areas, you have the right cemetery, because for me, I was looking for a Mills cemetery and it took me to Rocky Mount, and that's still Nash County, but actually it was in Spring Hope was the Mills cemetery. That's literally a small family cemetery behind a residential area. So it wasn't the cemetery that's a larger one that's off the highway. So you have to just verify with people, like we said tonight, on locations of grave sites, cemeteries, genealogy things. And I'm so glad that we had this talk tonight, everybody. It was great. We went a little over time. I'm glad that we still have so many people still joining us online. And this will be posted to our YouTube channel, which is the Lux Blog NC. I'm the creator of the Lux Blog NC, and Allison is one of my photographers on our team of 12, and great creative individuals. It will be uploaded up there for you guys tomorrow. So you can check it out on YouTube up there for that. And this conversation has been great. I want to close out with everyone, please giving your name again, and also where we can follow you and any new updates or things you want us to know. So start with Allison. Anything you want to tell us, or tell us where we can follow you and all that good stuff?
So you can follow me on Instagram _ Allison, ALLISON, Mathews, MATHEWS. I'm not gonna plug all the other stuff that I do, but my Angelou Center for Health Equity, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter under the handle WF as in Wake Forest, MACHE, My Angelou Center for Health Equity.
All right, Stephen, what about you next?
Yeah, you can just follow us at arccenter.org, AARCcenter.org, and we have everything in terms of our social media, YouTube, and all that stuff there, and as well as projects and other significant events we're doing. So just check us out there.
Awesome. Frederick, where can we follow you?
Yeah, you can follow me at History Before Us. Again, that's History Before Us on Instagram, Facebook, as well as the website is historybeforeus.com. At historybeforeus.com, you can see the trailer for the new documentary, The Other Side of the Coin, Race, Generations, and Reconciliation, as well as the old documentary, The American South as We Know It. So that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Portia, where can we follow you?
You can follow me on my social Facebook page. Is the Indigenous and Black Solidarity. That is where I like to connect with people. All of the information about anything that we have going on, any funding that we're trying to create for the programs that we're involved in is there, and it's a great environment for educational purposes. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Brianna, where can we follow you?
You can find me in the Halawasaponi Ancestry/DNA Facebook group. I don't have direct message set up for the group, so that's something I'll have to look into. But you can definitely find me in the group and direct message me that way, or you can email me at btayl9905@gmail.com.
Awesome. Everybody, you can follow us. Many of you watching us right here on Black Indians NC on Facebook. We're also on Instagram, so check us out on Instagram. You can also follow me at _Kimberly M. Knight on IG, and I'm also on Facebook, Kimberly M. Knight, and of course the Lux Blog NC at the Lux Blog NC. So you can follow us there. We're going to close out tonight. I would like to dedicate tonight's episode to my grandparents. These are my grandparents on my mother's side of the family. So this is Bill Lucas, Wilbert Bill Lucas, and this is Noni Wiggins Lucas. This is my grandmother. So this is my maternal side of my family, my mother's parents, and they are from Nash County. I am researching his father. So when I was talking about that tonight, it's his dad that I'm looking into. So his grandmother was a Mills. So that's where we're looking into their side of the family. So I just wanted to dedicate this episode to these wonderful ancestors of mine. And again, thank you all for tuning in. We will be back next month. It seems like we're getting a trend of being the last Tuesday of the month. So that might be our new thing. But we will be talking about some more topics. Please comment below in Facebook, or you can also inbox me like you've been doing, or email me at blackindiansnc@gmail.com if you have questions. And we will be posting more content coming up about the powwow. These conversations are meant to lead up to 2021 September powwow that we'll be having next year for Black Indians NC. We're in the process of that advisory council, which later on you'll get to learn more about. We're building this powwow up to that point. So these are conversations we're having leading up to the live event when times are much safer. So definitely, if you would like to participate as a vendor, or if you're interested in funding us, or any type of opportunities that you can be with us, please email me at blackindiansnc@gmail.com. And again, have a wonderful night, everyone. Thank y'all so much.
All right, good night, everybody.
Have a great
Thank you.
night.